everyone, this is your host Rachel with The Power of Religion, and today we're going to talk about how religion is used in cults as mind control. A podcast dedicated to how religion has influence over the masses. This podcast will cover a variety of topics spanning from cults to residential schools. A cult I've been interested in recently is the Jonestown Massacre, the single largest mass suicide in recent history. In a remote jungle in Guyana, Jim Jones gathered his cult of loyal followers called the People's Temple, and through different manipulation tactics, mostly through religious persuasion, caused them to take their own lives. But who was Jim Jones, and how did he have so much control? Jim Jones was born May 14, 1931, to James and Lynetta Jones. Young Jones grew up in poverty during the time of the Great Depression. He was neglected by his family and often cared for by the neighbors. The Jones family was considered odd by the people who knew them. Young Jim didn't have many friends. He was often alone. Childhood playmates remember him holding mock church services and funerals for dead animals. During his adolescence, Jones was an avid reader of Adolf Hitler and Karl Marx, and he was fascinated by the idea of a communist government. He would later go on to join the Communist Party of Indiana, wanting to introduce others to his radical mindset. As a teenager, Jones met his soon-to-be wife Marceline while working as a hospital orderly. Marceline Baldwin was a nursing student, and they married in 1949. The Joneses had several blood children, as well as adopted children, who they fondly referred to as the Rainbow Family. He and Marceline adopted a part Native American child, 3 Korean children, and were the first white couple in Indianapolis to adopt a black child. In Indianapolis, Jim Jones served as a student pastor in the Methodist Church in 1952. Jones had a vision for a better world, thus founding his own church, People's Temple, in 1956. Jim Jones was described as being both charismatic and disturbed. He amassed quite a large following due to his charisma as well as his sermons, which focused on tolerance, community, and inclusion. Segregation was widespread across the country during the 1950s, and, being somewhat of an outsider himself, Jim Jones took pity on the segregated. Jones preached on integration and equality. This attracted a largely Native American follower base. As the church grew, the sermons on equality were twisted with his own demands for loyalty and obedience. To allow more people to flock to his message, Jones integrated his extremist beliefs into a form of religion, causing people to commit themselves fully to his unusual ideals. Jones performed healing sessions and clairvoyant realizations, which attracted many spiritualists. On one such occasion, Jones drugged one of the church community members, put her arm in a cast, and told her it had been broken, then removed the cast to reveal that he had healed her broken arm. This was one of the ways in which Jones manipulated the minds of those within the People's Church. Let's be real, this was a cult. By the 1970s, the People's Temple was being painted as such in the media, a cult, a place where followers weren't allowed to leave. Because of this widespread hate, Jones became more and more paranoid, thus deciding to move the congregation to a remote jungle in Guyana, about 500 miles from the U.S. border. Jonestown was portrayed as a socialist paradise. However, Jones had complete power. He had restricted the visas of all of his followers, thus keeping them from leaving the country. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't. Everyone was reliant on Jones for everything from spiritual support to food to news from the outside. Jones was the only channel of knowledge in an isolated society. Within this community, white night rehearsals were performed. During these events, Jim Jones would pass around cups of Kool-Aid. After members drank, Jones would tell everyone they had ingested poison and would die within the next 30 minutes or so. There was widespread panic over the congregation during these rehearsals. As White Night suggests, however, there was no poison within the drinks, which Jones would let the crowd know just as they felt they were about to pass away. It was pretty much impossible to leave the community, as Jones had told members to turn anyone in who remotely brought up the subject. This pitted husbands on wives, wives on husbands, parents on children, and children on parents. If one were to turn someone into Jones, the turner in was in Jones's good graces and showed their level of devotion. This tactic was another way in which Jones used mind control on his followers. The use of this tactic made the congregation scheme against one another and become increasingly more reliant on Jim Jones, as he was the only person they could trust. Jim Jones believed that his followers should address him as their father, and later, as he became more delusional, Christ or God himself. Jones believed he was a god and commanded his followers to believe it too. Back in Canada, relatives of the people in Jonestown were becoming increasingly worried about the well-being of their relatives. Together they gathered a group and named it Concerned Relatives. They wrote letters to the U.S. Secretary of State encouraging investigation into Jonestown. In retaliation, Jones hired an attorney to try and prove that the CIA, FBI, and U.S. Postal Service was trying to fabricate a conspiracy against him. On November 14, 1978, Leo Ryan, a U.S. representative, and a group of investigators traveled to Jonestown to investigate their practices. The congregation did a convincing job at showing how much they enjoyed being in Jonestown. However, several sneaky notes had been passed to the investigators, who now knew to help. On November 18, 1978, over 900 members of the People's Temple religious cult committed mass suicide. After Jones got word of the plane sent for rescue, he began preparing a large vat of grape flavor laced with cyanide. Jones called all temple members to the cabana where he held most of his meetings and explained that they were to commit revolutionary suicide. Jim Jones manipulated the congregation into believing that if they didn't kill their children and themselves with cyanide, then others would. Thus the name revolutionary suicide. The crowd was coerced into believing that this was their only way out. Through his use of clairvoyant revelations, fake healing sessions, and brainwashing, Jim Jones was able to convince his cult that he was a trustworthy man. Jim Jones used religion as a way of cultivating a following, and as a way of controlling the minds of those followers. As always, this is your host Rachel with The Power of Religion, and we hope to see you come back next week with our talk on residential schools.